Today, a conversation on data centers, public subsidies, and the future of economic development in El Paso. In late 2023, with little fanfare, the city and county governments in El Paso gave generous subsidies to Meta Platforms, the parent company of Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp, in exchange for the tech giant spending a lot of money to build a data center in Northeast El Paso. The incentives the city and county gave to Meta mostly include an 80% break on property taxes for decades and $12.5 million to repair the road infrastructure immediately around the data center. As I look back, the data center deal escaped major scrutiny. Maybe the artificial intelligence boom and related data center build-out weren't as frenzied and as much of a topic at this time 2 years ago. In truth, it's something I look back on as a miss on my part as a reporter. And local organizers and even people working in our local governments have also told me the deal with Meta flew under their radars as well. Now, in late 2025, the topic of data centers in the borderland is among the major issues facing our region, maybe the biggest one. To supporters of Meta's data center deal, the company's $1.5 billion investment here is a huge victory, something that will boost the tax base in El Paso and have one of the world's biggest companies establish a footprint in our city. Even with the tax breaks in place, the city's economic development department has said Meta will still be paying millions of dollars in local taxes annually over the life of the deal. And the data center is expected to employ 100 workers. But to critics, the subsidies are a handout from a low-income city to a mega corporation that doesn't need to be subsidized and that will come here and consume, on average, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water per day. For perspective, Meta generated a profit of $2.7 billion in the 3 months spanning from July through September, and the company is sitting on a $44 billion cash pile. I'm Diego Mendoza-Moyers, a reporter with El Paso Matters. And for this episode of the El Paso Matters Podcast, I'll be talking with Andy Vargas, a veteran of the technology and finance industries and a managing partner of the venture capital firm No Border Ventures. Data centers appear to be an increasingly integral part of our local government's plan to improve El Paso's economy and job market. But Andy has been critical of the subsidies that local governments awarded Meta, and he shares his thoughts on what the future of economic development in El Paso should look like. I do want to note that the topic of data centers' water and electricity consumption is important, and we didn't touch on that in detail in this podcast. But check out elpasomatters.org to read a story we're publishing about Meta's water usage, which El Paso Water estimates could average 400,000 gallons of water per day. And before I bring Andy on, I want to mention that this El Paso Matters podcast episode is brought to you by our podcast title sponsor, Tani, Acosta, and Chaparro, truck crash and injury attorneys. Their team of local, seasoned trial attorneys are ready to help if you've been injured in a crash. We're also sponsored by the Greater El Paso Association of Realtors. If you're looking for a realtor or for a property to buy or rent, visit elpasotx.com. And you can sign up for El Paso Matters free newsletter and read our reporting on data centers and many other topics at our website, elpasomatters.org. While you're there, you can also sign up for the inaugural El Paso Matters 9.15K run on December 7th. Registration for the run is open through December 6th. Now, on to our conversation. Andy, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So before we start, can you just share a little bit about your background and who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a 17th generation Tejano. I'm also a first generation college graduate who grew up on the east side and who was raised by a hardworking family. My mother worked for one of the most iconic manufacturing companies in the 80s, 70s, 80s, for El Paso, back when manufacturing existed and when fabricas existed on this side of town, of the country, of the line. She worked for FARA.
Okay.
She worked for FARA for 25 years. And I attribute a lot of her work with, basically her entire life, career to FARA because it shaped how I thought about economic development and how I thought about the impact that a big company can do for the community. It also, helped me understand more about workers' rights and much of what a binational company, is all about. And much of what manufacturing once was to the United States, I am noticing a renaissance. of manufacturing, of American dynamism. I wrote a piece for El Paso Matters, which talks more about that. And as I've moved back, right, after 15 years of being away away from El Paso, this has very much influenced, how I've gotten involved with the community and how I think and my perspective. I graduated with a master's last year, and I returned to El Paso, my hometown, and I co-founded No Border Ventures, which focuses in investing in the Southwest and also in creating regional competitiveness. And my background in those 15 years has been a combination of energy trading, investment banking, capital markets, cloud infrastructure at AWS, and now venture, plus civic involvement in the Borderplex. And I also have served, and I've had the privilege of serving as in the Regional Renewable Energy Council. I've worked with data center adjacent companies, and I've mentored tech founders all over the country and in Latin America. And today I help train some of the top AI labs in the world as a finance expert. So all that to say, Diego, I'm very much interested in, how do we make sure that the Southwest, right, isn't just a place where AI gets built, but a place where our people share in the upside.
Yeah, and I appreciate you going through that. You have kind of an interesting background, which is why I wanted to talk to you about, this data center issue and this, development of AI and so forth that we're seeing here.
Yeah.
I guess just to get into it, can you share your general perspective on particularly the Meta data center that's, coming here to Northeast El Paso and, what you make of it, both as a project and also the deal that, the incentive deal that the city and county agreed to with Meta. Curious for your thoughts on that. And I'll just add, I think it's an interesting project because I think that there's a really massive gap between the perception of our elected officials and sort of developers and so forth versus just the public that I think has a fairly negative view of it. And so it's been interesting to see that gap. And so I'm curious your thoughts on the project generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I jump into answering your question, I will say that, these opinions are my own, and they in no way are representative of any organizations or companies that I am affiliated with.
Sure.
And so, but with that said, I think it's very important to keep context of how this deal originated before we jump into more of the, more on the details. But this deal was in largely part made by a previous city manager and a previous mayor and city council, DeMargo at the time, and also enlarged by Governor Abbott, who at the time, we can think of where, as tech companies approach the state of Texas, where did they want to place, and enlarged, he had a big, he had a big effort to move these data centers west of Texas. And so we found, as we found data centers in Abilene and Midland, in that region, we found one in El Paso. But the truth is that city officials love these deals, right? But the public doesn't. And both sides aren't necessarily wrong. I do think that they're just talking about different outcomes. And the question doesn't necessarily become whether or not data centers will be built. The question is how they will be built and where. And those answers can be driven largely by utility commissioners, and we can delve into that. I think we have an outdated policy that could, if updated, could largely benefit the tax rate, the taxpayer at large. We can delve into that later. But I do believe that cities grow through diversified industries. And as we talk about the Meta data center, El Paso shouldn't chase the deal, right? I think that the deal should meet El Paso's standards and every city's standards. And so the city is seeing clearly the promise of investment but the public is feeling the pressure on resources, right? And understandably so. And so how do you reconcile the two, right? How do you prepare what I think is the next phase? The data center is coming, right? But how do we prepare the community for what's to come? I think that becomes the bigger question, right? And data centers can absolutely help a region, right? They can expand the tax base, they can modernize the grid, they can signal that a community is ready to compete in AI, in the AI economy, but they also come with real costs. They strain power, they require water, and the benefits only materialize. They only materialize if they are structured well and if these deals are negotiated well. So I think the key is not to be for or against them. I think that the question here is to be more thoughtful, right? And tie the incentives to actual performance, require companies to fund their infrastructure, prioritize efficiencies throughout the data centers, and make sure that the community sees the real value, not just the headlines, and not just some of the leaders praising a data center and a big name company coming to town. There's more things that should be touched upon, but I think first to understand, like, it's important to understand what are they. And I think a lot of the public may have different versions of what they believe. But for the El Paso people, data centers, as someone who has worked, one of the last roles that I held, or responsibilities at Amazon and at AWS, was the location, the co-location, the design, and the valuation of data centers. What are data centers? Well, they're warehouse-like facilities, right, that house computing and they house networking equipment. Probably every website that you, Diego, and every other El Pasoan uses, anywhere from social media to Netflix to ordering groceries, if you do, to using a website, any website, that all is hosted through data centers, right? And they generally have very special infrastructure for cooling, for high throughput networking, for fire suppression, and reliable power delivery. And some data centers are the size of large data centers, or the size of large warehouses, that is. And some are small as just a floor in an office building. And then there's some much bigger ones, hyperscalers, some that, we will be seeing around the state line of New Mexico and Texas rather soonish, and others built around the country. I mean, you look at Midland, the West Texas region, and what Stargate is doing. But I will touch on these 2 points, on these two sides, why the praise exists. And well, it's because Meta brings large capital expenditures, right? In this case, 1.5 billion. Typically, they do an average about 2 to 5 billion, and data centers pay for what? Construction wages. The cities rely heavily on the headlines to show momentum. And El Paso has one of the cheapest grid lines, electric, grids in the country, and certainly in Texas. We benefit from the fact that we don't share our grid with the rest of Texas, with ERCOT, that is.
Sure.
We have our own independent grid, and well, that's an upside to infrastructure development. Jobs, especially not necessarily software jobs, but the full-time jobs that they bring to data centers are mostly in IT, and they're mostly in energy management, right? And to some degree, tax base, to some degree. And I say that because there's a place in Virginia called Loudoun County where they're the prime example of how data centers now generate 50% of the county's property tax revenue. and they allowing basically large municipal benefits like those to effectively lower the tax rate. However, as we all know, that only benefits homeowners. It doesn't benefit the lower class and the lower class renters who are still, on the hook for a living situation. But that's a different story. And there's a reason why it's called Data Center Alley, right? It's a cluster of data centers. That's not El Paso's story. And so now what I want to touch upon is it's the public frustration, right? Residents feel like they're giving up tax breaks to companies that don't hire locals and drive electricity prices up. Certainly so.
Or need tax breaks, right? These high value, companies generating a lot of, profit and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And there's also a point of taxpayer exposure from incentive management, right? That's important, and there's a misalignment there. Whereas Virginia, the example that I just brought in earlier, is now proposing a 14-year customer contract to prevent exactly the type of public risk, signaling that earlier deals may have been overly generous. And new state revenue for every dollar spent on the exemption, well, it turns out that you lose more than you gain. And that's true. There has been numerous studies that show that providing largely sized tax abatements, or synonymously tax exemptions, result in a loss for communities. Water and power stress in hot, arid regions like El Paso is very real. In this case, I know, and I don't know very much of the details, I wasn't part of the negotiations or have read any of the documents, but I do understand that it's running on a closed loop system. In a closed loop system, you typically just fill up once, right? And the data center is able to treat the water, recycle the water, and use it once again. Yes, and I'd say, there's pros, there's definitely pros and cons, a little bit more pros that, you're only able to fill it up once, but people should be wary. I think the most important part is the makeup rate, the rate at which, essentially with the hot summer days, some of that evaporation that happens inside these buildings, any building, the makeup water that is being used, right? And as we know, these data centers use millions of water, of water usage. And El Paso, as you know, El Paso receives 50% of their water through their annual allocation through through Colorado and through northern New Mexico, and it flows into into our city, into our infrastructure here, and the rest is done through basins like the Waco and the Mesilla aquifers, right? We also benefit from the fact that we have a state-of-the-art treatment facility, right? I've had the opportunity to visit the treatment center, and it's quite impressive. But there's still more work to do. There's still more infrastructure updating that needs to be done here. Even if we have some of the cheapest electricity prices per kilowatt, in the country, there are still many other projects. Meta, Alphabet, Microsoft, ByteDance, X, and Snap, they spent just on data center alone $61.5 million on lobbying in 2024.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a 13% increase from the year prior.
To overcome public backlash.
Exactly. Yeah. And data centers aren't necessarily job creators in abundance, right? Like the data center itself, it's the tertiary and the adjacent industries that are, right? In what made us facility, this data center is maybe going to have 15 to 20 full-time jobs expected here in El Paso. But, every tech company unless it's strictly carved out, a lot of those jobs become remote. And a lot of those jobs are filled by out-of-towners. That's the reality. They won't necessarily be, filled by local Pasoans. That's a big frustration, of course, for the El Paso people and the people of the North who reside in the Northeast. I think that there should also be a policy on reform by commissioners, utility commissioners, where that regulatory mindset needs to evolve, where they allow utilities not to just be cost centers, but to be strategic partners, right, in enabling the digital economy infrastructure. And I think, Paso Electric has done a good job. There's a fund that's able to, to fund and provide capital to many of the city's needs, but we need more of that, right? And that is another topic which I'm happy to cover another time. But another example, one more example is like Nebraska. Nebraska is learning from Virginia's examples. A lot of data centers going into Nebraska. Now the state of Nebraska is requiring large industrial customers to pay for their own substations and other infrastructure, as Google did with the Lincoln data center. So, these data centers, there's a reason why the public is very frustrated. I mean, they require massive amounts of electricity. Data centers are expected to triple their energy usage in a few years by 2028. And ERCOT's 2031 forecast has jumped to 218 gigawatts, right? That's half of U.S. daily demand.
Wow.
Let's think about it for a second.
Wow.
That's, it's the enormity of the situation. And 1 gigawatt, for perspective, 1 gigawatt is enough to power 250,000 Texas homes in a hot summer day, okay? And my last point here, just on the public frustration, and as I weigh in on this deal, well, there's a problem between capacity keeping up, demand keeping up with capacity, right? And with data centers being built across the United States, we are entering a very outdated electricity grid. There's going to be a lot of updates and, of course, restorations and repairs. But we've been seeing power outages, right? And perhaps it's not anything new, but the more we operate as consumers on the cloud and through computing, the more it interrupts services. It's interrupted. Power outages have interrupted the services of many companies and Fortune 100 companies, right? Because we rely on supercomputing and because we rely in this type of technology. And lastly, inflation, prices, right? Inflation, the inflation engine of the 20th century, of the 21st century, wasn't oil, it's compute. Mm-hmm. So even if AI firms pay for connection fees, the ripple effects inflate steel, they inflate transformer and capital across the system. And some say that data centers might even lower electricity by spreading fixed costs, but that logic belonged to the 2010s, a decade, 2 decades ago, when the grid had more capacity. It simply doesn't anymore.
Yeah, no, that's a comprehensive answer. And I'll just on the electricity point, I thought it was really interesting is El Paso Electric kind of set up this special rate for Meta's data center. And of course, El Paso Electric has said consistently that all of the costs that are created by Meta showing up here, that they're covering them and they're paying El Paso Electric for every bit of infrastructure. And the PUC, or one of the public utility commissioners, made this point that why, like, that there's a concern that potentially El Paso Electric builds all this stuff to serve Meta and the substations and poles and wires and so forth, and then El Paso Electric charges the rest of us for it, right?
Yeah.
And so the PUC flagged that and said, hey, you have to provide evidence in some form that ratepayers aren't subsidizing Meta. So it's interesting that that's a real key concern about, hey, we want to welcome data centers, but do it in a way where you're ensuring that the costs are borne by the company that's building it. I guess I'm just curious your thoughts generally on the kind of the AI development race we're seeing, and it's interesting how we've El Paso, this isolated city, has sort of landed within this frenzy, right, of AI with Meta, but also this Project Jupiter that's part of the Stargate initiative, right? That's OpenAI and Oracle just across the state line here.
Correct.
And so, but just curious with your experience and just kind of your thoughts on the really big race that we're seeing with the AI development.
Yes, I mean, I think on the macro side, we are in the middle, or the beginning innings of a running race against two major superpowers, the United States and China. And I think it's important to keep that into context, because the first power to find the breakthrough into supercomputing will hold a lot of power over the world. And the threat alone of supercomputing is very real. I mean, it threats our banking system, it threatens our government, it threatens everyday consumer life, right? And it's to no surprise that data centers are being built across the country, right? It's a necessity to be able to break through, that chasm of this AI frontier. And AI isn't necessarily software per se. It's infrastructure, it's energy, and it's compute. And so there's a reason why these hyperscalers are racing for GPU capacity, right? You see Microsoft's big $120 billion spend. Project Jupiter is another great example. Meta's $72 billion project, and Google's $25 billion project in the PJM market down, on the East Coast of the United States. These data centers are requiring more power and more cooling than traditional cloud. When we think of the early innings of cloud, when Rackspace was among the pioneers of cloud infrastructure, an amazing job, and how much since Rackspace and then the adoption of AWS moving into cloud, and then Microsoft and the other big tech companies, how much they've pushed, right, the frontier of cloud infrastructure. Today, we're in the world of AI and compute, and so AI is causing a redesign everywhere, right? Operators are ripping up their old plants, and because new GPUs, right, have 3-5 times more the density, a higher density. And so, yeah, I do think at the macro level, we are in a race between us and China. And AI has started to break the grid, not metaphorically, but literally. The demand is growing faster than our ability to generate power. I think it's probably an opportune time when we think about how you power data centers, we reintroduce the world of nuclear energy. It's not necessarily too far-edged now, given our necessities and given how much more safe nuclear energy and how much more development has poured, not only through capital but through technological development for nuclear energy. That could potentially be a source outside of renewable energy for these massive consumers of energy. And at the end of the day, there's a bottleneck, right? There's a bottleneck that exists with power, people, and with policy. There's not enough capacity. There's not enough talent to build, to commission, and operate, because of the people carrying the subject matter experts, they're in one place. They can't necessarily be in all places at once. And to train people, to train a workforce, to be able to, basically pass down all that knowledge, and to train someone very well to run a data center takes time, right? And how many of these are being, they're popping up every month.
So a new headline almost every day, a $50 billion investment in data centers here and there. And, yeah,
exactly. Yes. And, there's also and there's a negotiation piece. There's many, site rejections are happening because AI workloads have changed design requirements midstream. What these companies do. I mean, these tech companies, they reach out to municipalities, right? Less so metropolitan cities, but more suburban.
Kind of like with Doñana County over here, I guess, right? I mean,
they call them and they try, they try to negotiate, and simply, if their needs are not met, they simply hang up the phone and move on to the next municipality until they reach a municipality that is willing to work with them. That's the fact of the matter.